we know quite a bit about how languages have evolved over history. We also know that this is not a process that is done with foresight or with deliberate intention by the speakers of that language. They are just as unwitting and as unconscious in the activities that they engage in, which do the selecting, as they were in the gradual development of domesticated grains and domesticated animals. It was only a gradual process that brought them to the point where they could begin thinking deliberately and foresightfully about the very cultural entities that they were now surrounded with and that they were finding themselves using. Think of, for instance, the early days of music, when a few proto-musicians began humming tunes or making sounds with no particular aim, but they found they rather enjoyed this, and they also found that some of the little ditties they hummed were picked up by their conspecifics. They spread. They didn't know why, but they liked the effect, and pretty soon you begin to get traditions of certain musical forms growing up without any composers, without any deliberate composition, without any deliberate invention, but just with the spreading of habits from individual to individual, and with natural selection over the means, pruning these down to the ones that were the best replicators, the one that stuck in the head the best, the ones that were most readily transmitted from one singer to the next, and so forth. That's a long way from that initial strummer, doodler, hummer to Johann Sebastian Bach. Bach is a methodical breeder of musical means. We honor him as an intuitive genius, but the fact remains that part of his genius lay in the extremely resourceful use he made of the domesticated materials that he was given. Think, for instance, of his chorale cantatas. Where did he get the melodies? He got them from the culture. He took the melodies that already had been polished and honed for generations in his culture. These were the tunes that people already knew, the tunes that already struck chords in their hearts that had tremendous emotional resonance for them. He had the wisdom to take those domesticated tunes and then run variations on them, putting them together into new, more artful forms. And he used all the technology at his disposal. He used counterpoint. He used musical notation. He used all the latest instruments. He was the musical technocrat of his age. He was not just an intuitive genius. He was a musical sort of proto-engineer doing with musical means what breeders were doing to improve the breed of domesticated species. Now, as the 20th century winds down, we're beginning to discover that the fourth category of cultural engineering is looming, and that's what you might call mimetic engineering. There is a computer program written by the composer David Cope called EMI. It stands for Experiments in Musical Imagination. It's written over 1,000 symphonies, and some of them are quite good. And if you wonder how good EMI is, I was at a conference with a lot of professors of music and composers at which there was a sort of touring test of EMI productions, a concert where imitation EMI Bach, imitation EMI Puccini, Schubert, Mozart, and Scott Joplin were played, and not a single person in the room got them all right. Every person in that room identified one EMI composition as written by one of those other composers, one of the composers. That's how good mimetic engineering is getting. And that's just on the production side. If we begin to feel a little anxious here, it's not we can understand the reason. I'm sure that if Douglas Adams comes to confront the possibility that somebody's writing a computer program which is going to brilliantly psych out the human cognitive system so that it can write much funnier novels than he can, 500 a year. This might bring out a certain Luddite impulse even in him. We have to remember that in mimetic engineering, as in genetic engineering, what Francis Crick once mischievously called Orgel's second rule applies, and that is that natural selection is cleverer than you are. A lovely case in point is Leonard Bernstein. Back in 1955, in the New York Times, he published a wonderful dialogue called, "Why Don't You Run Upstairs and Write a Nice Gershwin Tune?" And in this piece, he laments the fact that he, a trained musician, a mimetic engineer with the highest tech capacities, was unable to do what George Gershwin could do. He couldn't get the tunes into the people's head. Now, that was 1955. A couple of years later, West Side Story opened, and his anxieties were over forever. But the things he said, I'll quote you one sentence from this 1955 piece. He said, "It's just that it would be nice to hear someone accidentally whistle something of mine somewhere just once." The selective power of natural selection is always there. It's never absent in the land of cultural evolution as much as in the land of biological. Why should we adopt this approach to looking at culture? I think one reason that Douglas Adams already mentioned. The evolutionary perspective gives us new ways of looking at lots of traditional topics. Opening them up to novel hypotheses, novel interpretations, we begin to class together phenomena that otherwise seem quite disparate. And this leads us to further hypotheses that can be tested. And finally, too, it's because we've got to tell the story of how all those reasons got into our heads. Consider the fledgling cuckoo. When it's born, the first thing it does when it comes out of the nest is it looks around, and if there's still any other eggs, remember it's a parasitic bird. Its egg is laid in a host bird's nest, and it's competing with those other eggs. The first thing that fledgling cuckoo does is to shoulder any other eggs out of that nest. Now, we know why that's happening, but the cuckoo's clueless. The cuckoo doesn't have to understand the rationale of its own act. For 4 billion years on this planet, there were reasons that nobody appreciated. Natural selection had rationales for a lot of its designs, but they were what I called free-floating. We're the first species in which these rationales have alighted and are now represented. We're the species that knows about reasons and cares. That's what sets us off from all the others. We have to understand how it could come to be that evolution could gradually produce minds that can know reasons. And I suggest that the perspective, the only perspective from which we'll be able to see this, is ultimately the Darwinian perspective. Thank you very much.